So we're going to talk a little bit about the American Revolution today. Our key concept is the same as last time: the British attempts to assert tighter control over North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government leads to colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. So today we're going to talk about the colonists and how they wanted to assert their ideals of self-government in the face of renewed British imperial efforts, and this all led to colonial independence movement and war with Britain. So first, the imperial struggles of the mid-18th century, as well as the new British efforts to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent, and to assert imperial authority in the colonies, unites the colonists against perceived and real constraints on their economic activities and political rights. When we talk about taxes today, or acts that set up taxes, I want you to realize that there's not a huge economic disadvantage for the colonists paying taxes. However, they have political issues with most of these taxes. The Sugar Act was passed in 1764 and the Stamp Act was passed in 1765. These were passed by Parliament in Great Britain to increase the British tax revenue. It was a tax on colonists. The cost of the French and Indian War financially crippled the British and they needed money. Parliament passes the tax because they believed that the colonies should pay for their own protection, which is why the British military was there. The colonists saw the tax as economically harmful, even though we just discussed the tax wasn't very high and it didn't hurt them that much economically. Most of all, they saw it as politically questionable. The question was, did Parliament have the right to tax the colonists? The Stamp Act was passed in 1765, and it was the first tax levied directly on the colonists by the British government. The Sugar Act actually taxed merchants, not the actual colonists. The colonists argued, going back to the Stamp Act, that they could not be taxed without actual representation in Parliament, and they often resorted to mob violence to intimidate stamp collectors into resigning. The Quartering Act, Declaratory Act, and Townshend Acts were passed in 1765, 74 for the Quartering Acts. Declaratory Act was 1766, and then the Townshend Act started in 1767. So the Quartering Act, 1765 and 1774, they required colonists to provide British soldiers in the area with necessary accommodations like housing and food. The soldiers were not originally put into the private homes of the settlers, but that it's just as bad, according to the colonists. The British needed a solution for British soldiers stationed in the British colonies after the French and Indian War. They needed to put the soldiers somewhere. The Quartering Acts acted as this solution. It replaced the need for the British to build military bases, and it was less costly to the English. But because the British soldiers were put in public places like meeting halls, town centers, the colonists were infuriated because they lost their privacy, and the British soldiers used their resources without reimbursing them. The Declaratory Act was passed in 1766. It was passed along with the repeal, so the Stamp Act is repealed, with the repeal of the Stamp Act, meaning Parliament took it away. But when they took the Stamp Act away because the colonists were very upset, they passed this Declaratory Act that said Parliament has the same power to tax colonies as it does in Britain, basically saying we take away the Stamp Act, but this Declaratory Act says in the future, if we tax you, you be quiet and you pay it. The colonists celebrated the victory of the repeal of the Stamp Act, but the Declaratory Act, passed at the same time, led to the implementation of many more acts that make the colonists very upset politically. The Townshend Acts, passed in 1767, taxed the colonists on glass, paint, paper, lead, and tea imported to the colonies. In 1770, Parliament actually repeals all of the Townshend duties, taxes on imported goods, except the tax on tea, and that was a temporary truce. Many colonists, including Ben Franklin, believed taxes on the colonies were an abuse of British power. England misjudged the situation and thought the colonies would see paying taxes as their duty to the crown. The truce lasted for about 2 years, and in 1772, colonial resistance to the tea duties was a symbol of patriotic resistance to British tyranny. You've heard about the Boston Tea Party. All right, so the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts, and the Quebec Act continue this resistance by the colonists. All taxes and acts accumulate and lead to the Revolutionary War. The Tea Act in 1773 rekindles colonial resistance to duties and causes the Boston Tea Party incident. The British government had granted their East India Company a monopoly on tea trade in the colonies. The colonists viewed the tax on tea as unconstitutional, again, not worried about the money as much as they're worried about the political implication of paying taxes but not being represented in Parliament. The Boston Tea Party took place in December of 1773. Colonists board the East India Company ships in the Boston Harbor, and they dump tea overboard, then they burn the ships. We'll talk about this in class more if you want. They were super drunk. Parliament responds with the Intolerable Acts, which were very harsh measures to punish the colonists. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to move forward. The Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, were passed in 1774, and they punished the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. The British Parliament shut down the Boston Harbor. They forbade town meetings without royal approval. The soldiers made sure that happened. They made Massachusetts a crown colony, and they put the military under General Thomas Gage in charge. So they militarized the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This allowed British officers charged with capital offenses in law enforcement to go to trial in England instead of the colonies, and it protected the British officers because they didn't give colonial juries power. So the colonists lost their political rights, their just social rights to have meetings, and the second part of the Quartering Act was passed at this time. It allowed British soldiers to stay in towns and actually be housed in vacated buildings. Boston refused to repair their old buildings, so soldiers were actually forced to camp. So that was their act of resistance. And finally, the goal of the Intolerable Acts was to reestablish British control over the colonies. It was to separate Massachusetts from the rest of the colonies by punishing them and making them an example. What actually happened is it increased colonial outrage amongst all of the colonies. It brought the colonies closer together than ever before, and it led to the first Continental Congress meeting in 1774, which then leads to the decision to go to war against Great Britain. The next point is that the colonial leaders based their calls for resistance to Britain on arguments about the rights of the British subjects, the rights of individual local traditions of self-rule, and the ideas of enlightenment. So the first thing we'll talk about is taxation without representation. The British believed in virtual representation that we talked about yesterday, but some colonists argued for actual representation, which means colonists must have an elected representative in Parliament in order to be taxed. James Otis, a lawyer, argued for this in the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. Another big idea was the consent of the governed and republicanism. Consent of the governed is the idea that the authority of the government should come from the consent of the people through voting in elections, etc. John Locke came up with this in the Social Contract, and that idea is found in the Declaration of Independence, which is going to be written in 76. Republicanism is a critique of the monarchy. It eventually meant that colonists would remove the king and instill democracy. Ideally, in republicanism, a society is free of corruption, and they were free from the rigid class stratification that was found in England. Rather than power coming from hereditary privilege, like how the king gets power, standing armies, patronage, and religious establishments, republicanism means that the republic depends on independence and the moral virtue of citizens. Natural rights come from John Locke as well, from his Enlightenment writings. He believes that life, liberty, and property were the government's duty to protect. Otherwise, the government is not doing its job for the citizens. He used these ideas during Enlightenment to challenge the divine right of kings, and he justified the establishment on the social contract and republicanism, the establishment of government. These are all similar to the ideas of human rights. Thomas Jefferson put these words in the Constitution, but he substituted pursuit of happiness for property. And then finally, we have the bicameral colonial legislatures. A legislature is a lawmaking body with two houses. Bicameral would mean two houses, like the British Parliament's House of Commons and House of Lords. This is present in British colonies early on, so two interests can be represented in lawmaking. The mother country, represented by the governor, was in the council, and the colonists were represented by their chosen deputies and leaders. And that idea is going to increase as self-government becomes more fought for by the different colonies. All right, the effort for American independence was energized by colonial leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, as well as by popular movements that included political activism of laborers, artisans, and women. So the Sons of Liberty, this was a group established in Boston in 1765. It was a group of shopkeepers and artisans who called themselves the Loyal Nine. They began prepping early on for agitation against the Stamp Act when that was passed. This group became known as the Sons of Liberty, leading workers and tradesmen rather than the men of Boston as a whole. So it was a small select group. Two of the Sons published things in the Boston Gazette to showcase news and opinions and draw support. So they utilized publications to get a lot of support. Samuel Adams and John Adams were not technically members of the Sons of Liberty since they were both in the public eye and they couldn't be associated with violence. But Samuel Adams did have some sort of tie to the leadership in that group. Within a short period of time, there were 2,000 members. The actions taken by the Sons in August 1765, they hung an effigy, which is a likeness, almost like a puppet-looking thing, of Andrew Oliver, a tax collector or a distributor of stamps in Massachusetts. They hung his effigy in a tree next to a boot with a devil climbing out of it. Then they gather as a mob and they burn Oliver's property. They behead the effigy as a tactic of terror. They stone his house with people inside. There was a very clear statement of who ruled Boston, not the British militia. Or sheriffs, or justices. By the end of 1765, the Sons of Liberty exist in every colony. The objective was to force stamp distributors throughout the colonies to resign. They were effective in newsprint, not just violence. Many Sons were printers, publishers, and non-members also participated who were sympathetic in the cause. Printers had to pay most of the duties for stamps, so they were very upset about the stamp tax. Newspapers carried daily reports of the Sons' activities. In 1766, the Sons had displaced the royal government in nearly every colony, and they began to correspond between colonies and develop a larger organization. The Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania were a series of essays written by a man named John Dickinson, a Philadelphia lawyer and statesman. He wrote these from 1767 to 1768, and he published under the name of A Farmer. He wrote these in protest to the passage of the Townshend duties. The Stamp Act Congress were meetings held between October 7th through 25th in 1765 in New York City. Representatives from some of the British colonies in North America gathered in the Stamp Act Congress to create a protest against the new Stamp Act. Congress did not have royal permission to meet, and this caused alarm in Britain because they saw a bunch of people getting together and having illegal meetings. British merchants stopped importing British products, and this caused Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, but they passed the Declaratory Act on the same day. And finally, the Continental Congress. This was a convention of delegates from the 13 colonies that became the governing body in the American Revolution. They met from 1774 to 1789, and they first met in reaction to the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts passed in 1774. The Second Continental Congress met in 1775 after the Revolutionary War had already begun. In 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence against Great Britain, and in 1781, they ratified the Articles of Confederation, which is the first national constitution until 1789 when we pass our most current U.S. Constitution. In face of economic shortages and the British military occupation of some regions, men and women mobilized in large numbers to provide financial and material support to the Patriot movement. So first, we are going to talk about the committees of correspondence. These committees, let me find where I am. I'm so sorry, guys. Messing up. Formed throughout the colonies to coordinate action against Great Britain. Members were leading men of each colony, and they coordinated actions against Great Britain, leading to eventual war. And finally, the Massachusetts Minutemen, part of this occurrence of these meetings happened in Massachusetts. And these were civilian colonists who independently organized to form militia companies. They were self-trained in weaponry, tactics, and military strategies, and they were ready at a minute's notice. And so those are people who show up when we talk about the earliest battles of the American Revolution. And I'm not going to talk about all the battles of the Revolutionary War, but I'm going to talk about three. And these were three Patriot victories. So despite considerable loyalist opposition as well as many overwhelming military and financial advantages for Great Britain, the Patriot Cause succeeded because of the actions of colonial militias and the Continental Army, George Washington's military leadership, and the colonist ideological commitment and resilience, and the assistance sent later by European allies. So early on in the war, the Patriots are losing and losing and losing. But in 1776, which is the day after Christmas, in the Battle of Trenton, George Washington leads men in crossing the Delaware River. Over a few days, Washington defeats the Hessian mercenaries before he withdraws from the Battle of Trenton. And then there's going to be another Battle of Princeton, which is another victory to reassert American control over New Jersey. Both of these battles improved the morale and the unity of the colonial militia and armies, which was very necessary in the Revolutionary War. Then we have the Battle of Saratoga, which leads to a French alliance. There were two battles fought 17 days apart in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This marks a turning point in the American Revolution. By the end of September, British General Burgoyne wins a small victory over the Americans led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. He attacks the American forces again in early October, and Burgoyne was defeated and the British were forced to retreat. This American victory convinced the French to officially recognize the colonist cause and formally enter the war as an American ally. And without the French alliance, the Americans could not have won the American Revolution. The Battle of Yorktown took place in fall of 1781. The French and American troops laid siege to the British Army at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington and French General Rochambeau led an attack and captured two British defenses. This leads to the British General Cornwallis and his 9,000 troops to formally surrender. This was the final battle of the American Revolution, and after this, the British began to negotiate peace agreements because of this American victory. If you guys have any questions, please let me know.